All right, Tim, well, thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks for asking.
I'm going to ask you the hard questions, right? But the first one's a softball. I think it will help context here if you will just maybe give us a little bit of a, sort of background, the arc of your career, the kinds of things you have done, and then I'm going to have some more specific questions about several pieces of it.
Well, I was born on a hot nut. I'll start a little later than that. I went to the law school at the University of Georgia. Graduated 34 years ago now. I'm a native Georgian. I've lived in Georgia all my life up to that point, undergraduate at Emory and then law school at the University of Georgia. And I often think back now about what was in my mind when I entered law school. Why did I go to law school? And it's been so long, it's a little hard to remember. But I always, as far back as I can remember, thinking about a career, had law in mind. And so I went into law school right after college and graduated, say, 34 years ago, and have never looked back or regretted that decision.
Okay. Well, the first job that you had coming out of law school, if I'm reading this right, was as a law clerk.
Right.
Right. On the 11th Circuit. And I wonder if you could talk just a minute about what that experience was like, why it was a good one. I mean, I know it was, in general, and then, of course, particularly with Judge Kravitz.
Well, actually, it was a great experience. I thoroughly enjoyed that year, and I think I learned more in that year, my first year out after graduating, than any other job I can imagine. And I think that's true generally for folks that end up spending a year or 2 years clerking for a judge. This was an appellate judge, as you say, on the United States Court of Appeals. Actually, it was the Fifth Circuit. This is so long ago, it was before there was such thing as the 11th Circuit.
I forgot how old you are.
Shortly after I was there, they split the old Fifth Circuit created a new 11th Circuit that included Georgia. But the judge I clerked for, you mentioned, Judge Phyllis Kravitz, is a remarkable woman, a remarkable lawyer, just a wonderful judge. And it's one reason I say it was a great experience. Maybe the main reason is getting to know her and learn about her career and establishing a relationship with her that's lasted even to this day. She's now 94 years old this summer, but still goes to work most days, still participates in the work of the court to the extent she can. But what's so remarkable about Judge Kravitz is her career before she became a judge. At least that's one of the things that made her so interesting to me back then. She was the first woman trial judge in the state of Georgia. She was the first federal judge who was a woman in the Southeast. She was only the third woman in United States history to be appointed to the United States Court of Appeals. But she had a fascinating legal career. She represented criminal defendants. She did a wide range of civil rights kinds of work, all practicing in Savannah for many years before she became a judge. And so she's a big talker. I learned a lot from her, just her telling about her career and the varied kinds of cases and work she had done.
As a brand new lawyer, you're just out of law school, you're having this experience. Is there one thing you could look back on and say that you learned or that surprised you or that inspired you in that year? Is there one thing or one aspect of that experience that you could point to and remember?
It'd be hard to say one thing, but if I did, it would be really the joy she had in her career, doing a lot of different things, going through some real hardships. I mean, she struggled. There were a lot of people didn't think she should be a lawyer at all, and people that thought she should be a lawyer said she should never enter the courtroom. That's not a place for a lady. But she never was embittered or cynical about anything. She maintained a deep faith in the law and in the legal system, and thoroughly enjoyed her work. And I've tried to model myself after that. And I think I remember her almost every day as I'm thinking about my work. I think back to her attitude and her approach to all of this.
Our colleague and friend Mike Sabbath talks about the people you meet when you first get out of law school, and of course some of the students have had Mike, and they know his sense of humor, but he talks about imprinting, like a baby duck, right? You meet somebody early in your career and you imprint so much of who they are.
No, I think that's exactly right. I hate to agree with Mike Sabbath so profoundly, but he's right.
That'll be the last time I quote Mike this morning. That's fine. when you finished your clerkship, if I have the sequence right, you went to Sutherland, the Sutherland firm.
Right.
Now that's that's a big Atlanta law firm, big commercial firm. For many people, this would be the dream job for a young lawyer. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like, what you enjoyed about it, and of course why you left? I know you were there twice, but I'm talking about that early on.
Yeah, Sutherland was one of the very largest law firms in Atlanta at the time. There were almost 100 lawyers.
Oh, goodness.
Now, of course, the large firms have, even in Atlanta, have nearly 10 times that many lawyers. Sutherland's grown too, not quite that much. It's a large firm that represents primarily corporate interests and wealthy individuals. I went there primarily because I'd gotten to know a couple of folks who would work there, including Judge Tuttle, who's the former chief judge of the Fifth Circuit, who was in the chambers next to Judge Kravich. He was the founding partner of that firm, and I thought if Judge Tuttle could found a firm, it must be a pretty good firm, because I had enormous respect for him. And I got to know some of those people. But I got to tell you, it was not the kind of thing I would have told you I would do, say, the year before. When I went to law school, I was talking about my decision to go to law school, I was going to be a trial lawyer. And particularly, I was interested in criminal law. I didn't know anything about it, but in my mind, I thought I would love to be a criminal defense lawyer. I had read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school, and I had watched Perry Mason on TV, so I thought I knew all about it, and that's what I wanted to do. And then working with Judge Kravich, who had had the kind of career kind of like Atticus Finch. And her father, who was roughly, Judge Kravich was probably about the same age as Scout Finch, as Harper Lee's character in that. And so her stories about her father as a lawyer. So that was the kind of lawyer I thought I'd be, represent individuals and do trial work, maybe even in a small town, and of course ended up doing the opposite of all of that. And I've never regretted that decision either, because the great thing about a firm like Sutherland, and that firm in particular, brilliant lawyers with great resources who take their jobs very seriously, and they care about getting things right and doing it well. And I learned an awful lot about the craft of lawyering from the people I worked with at that firm. But as you pointed out, I did leave the firm after a couple of years or so, because that idea I had of being a trial lawyer, maybe doing criminal work, never left me. And even though I was in litigation at Sutherland, that didn't mean I went to trial. It meant I read a lot of documents, and every now and then I sat in on a deposition, and after a year I was able to take a deposition or two, but that wasn't really what I had in mind. I wanted to try my hand at being what I thought of then as a real lawyer, somebody who went into court on a regular basis.
Yeah, well, what we used to call back in Texas a stand-up trial lawyer.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? Not somebody that takes depositions sitting down. Well, since then, now it's over 30 years ago, most of your career has been spent in the academic side. Now, of course, a lot of it on the clinical side of academia. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it is you have enjoyed in being an academic. Now, we're going to talk about your particular kind of work and some of the clients, of course, you represented. But why academics?
Well, I'll go back to the original decision to go into academia. It really was not a decision to be an academic. I left Sutherland to go work in the clinic at the University of Georgia Law School. It was the legal aid clinic, which does, at the time, it was actually at the same time the public defender for the Western Judicial Circuit there in Athens. And so I went in there really to be a trial lawyer, working with students, many of them under the Third Year Practice Act, at the table with me, but I went there to be a trial lawyer. And only after I got into the job did I realize that what I loved about it more than anything, even more than the trial work, was working with students. And that's what I guess has sustained me for the over 30 years since, that I've spent most of my career working in law schools. And if I'd put at the top of the list of things that have made that what I've wanted to do and want to keep, I hope I'll just keep on doing it, is because I realized I thoroughly enjoyed working with law students. People, and especially the students who who wanted to get involved in representing clients and doing some real world stuff and translate the stuff they'd been learning in the classroom into what they could really use as they go forward in their career, which was the kind of work I was doing there in the clinic. And ever since then, I've spent most of my time in legal academia doing clinical, externship, real world kind of things. Now I've also taught most other courses in the curriculum. I've done pretty much everything. But it was that connection with students and helping students translate what's happening in the classroom into what they really can use to represent clients and be out there in the real world.
Right. And you were on really, in some ways, the front lines of the first generation of clinical education in American law schools.
There was almost nothing in the way of clinical education in the 1970s. It was in the 1980s that it really started to develop, and yeah, that's true. And I'm still committed to that, and I'm still hoping we can do more of that here at Mercer, and I think we will. But you know, being a law professor for all these years, it's a lot more than just what I said. You know, we teach, and that's the first job, and that's the most important job we have, and I love teaching. I've taught a lot of different things. I think I'd get tired of teaching the same thing every year, but one thing I like is learning and getting involved in different aspects, and teaching is a great way to learn a lot. But our job also includes, and it's really a part of our job that's maybe not as visible to students, is scholarship, research writing. And these students are just now taking their first legal writing class. That may not sound like something that's fun to do. The great thing about the writing that we do as professors is we research and write about what we really have a passion about. And to have, and to be part of your job, just to be able to look into questions that you really care about and you want to explore more and share your ideas, I've thoroughly enjoyed that part of the job too. But there's a third thing that's really expected of all professors, again, maybe not quite as visible to students as our teaching, and that's service. And that's something that's been really rewarding for me. I've been involved with the bar and working with lawyers and with agencies throughout my career, and being connected to the practice and with state bar committees. I'm glad I don't do that all the time, but to be in touch with folks on a regular basis who are out there doing great work has been a large part of it too. So really just the autonomy to get involved in things I really care about, that's hard to beat in work.
Well, the other Professor Floyd talked about how important autonomy is to somebody's happiness.
Well, yeah.
You know her.
I wouldn't argue with her.
That's because she's right.
That's true. That's another reason.
Yes, right. So you went into all this thinking you were going to represent criminal defendants. Mm-hmm. And you have in fact done that for a very long time. As we've been in our discussions this week, and every group has met except one, as we've been in our discussions, the notion of actually representing somebody accused of crime is something that it's clear some students feel like they can do, and some students feel like they just couldn't. What's the appeal of it to you? Where does the joy come from in representing people accused of crime?
Well, I would agree, it's not for everyone, and I think it really, as most things in this profession, but especially doing criminal work, either on the prosecution or defense side, it's not something somebody should do unless they really do get some joy out of it. Not 24/7 necessarily, it's not all fun and games, but we get some real fulfillment out of it. But then, I guess that's where you're heading. How does one get fulfillment out of spending much of your time dealing with folks who have done some really horrible things to other people? And some of those people are just unpleasant people, or worse.
Well, and there's another part to this question. I'm just going to throw it all out there. One of them is, where does the joy come from? And the other part is, how can you represent those people? I mean, how can you do that? You know, I mean, they've done these horrible things. How can you devote your time, energy, and talent to them, of all people?
Part of the answer to that question is, it's because if you don't do it, who will? Because even people who are, unpleasant, nasty individuals, even ones who are accused of doing some of the most horrible things other people can do, they are still human beings, and under our Constitution, they are entitled to be treated as are all other individuals. Everybody has the same rights, no matter who they are or what they're accused of doing. But it's also true in my case that it's more than just a matter of dedication to the Constitution. For me, it's a matter of my personal faith, as I talk about a little bit in the essay that everybody's read. For me, even people who are the lowest of the low, the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, both in terms of society, but also in terms of what they've done, they are still loved by God. And in my faith, I think we are called to love folks. We're all sinners. We've all fallen short, and some fallen a lot shorter than others. But God doesn't give up on people. And one reason that this line of work has always appealed to me is my faith tells me that we as a society and individuals shouldn't give up on people altogether either. And sometimes a criminal defense lawyer is the only person standing between somebody and the rest of society. Completely giving up on that person is absolutely worthless. And so that's sounding a lot more philosophical than it is on a regular basis. That's not what goes through your mind most of the time. But you ask the question, and if I really dig deep, I'd say that's an important part of it for me, at least.
Well, and that's a part of it I think we need to talk about a little bit more. You know, you've read the blogs the students have written. I've read the blogs the students have written. I asked them about their ethos and what meant something to them. There's a significant percentage of students in this room and in the room next door who wrote about religious faith, and that's where it came from. Not everybody. And so I think it's fair to ask you to talk to them for a minute about the role of your religious faith in being a lawyer. Can you be, in your particular case, can you be a good Christian and a good lawyer? Can you be authentic, to use the terminology that Dean Floyd uses, and integrate those parts of your life together? How do you do that? Is it hard?
Well, I'll answer the last question.
Answer any of those questions.
The first thing I'll say is it's certainly not easy. We're all works in progress, and you know, can you be authentic to your true self and be a good lawyer? I certainly hope so, but it's not something that anybody should ever take for granted. And now to talk about religious faith, obviously I think I need to talk about it personally, both because that's what I know the most about. But I also want everybody to understand, if we're going to talk about religious faith, I am not suggesting that anybody else should share my faith or anybody else's, or that somebody should have religious faith at all if they're going to be a lawyer. The reason I think it's important to talk about religious faith is really, well, that's precisely what you were saying. For at least some people, law students and lawyers, their religious faith is a central part of their identity. And what I am convinced of is if you try to separate out who you are at the deepest levels from what you do professionally, you're in trouble. You're in trouble kind of psychologically, morally. I don't think you can live a divided life like that. So, I mean, that's that word authenticity or integrity. You've got to be true to who you are. And if your religious faith is a central part of who you are, and at least from the religious traditions I know about, you know, for Christians and Jews and Muslims, at least, you know, God's got to be number one in your life. And if you put anything else in that place, then you're not being true to your faith. But that does raise all kinds of difficult questions. It's not simple to say, well, I'll just be a good Christian and then I'll also be a good lawyer. I think we have to deal with those questions all the time because nobody ever said it was going to be easy. The good news is I think there's a lot of fulfillment and joy in going through that. That's not the same thing as saying it's going to be simple and easy all the time, though.
Yeah, personally I would have found it hard to love thy neighbor, love thy adversary would be would be a pretty tough one. Yeah,
well, actually, that's maybe the most difficult commandment Jesus ever gave, and that is to love your enemies, and that goes against the grain of all of us. And it doesn't mean you approve of what people do. It doesn't mean you excuse the horrible things people do, but it does mean you have to treat them with fundamental respect and dignity that entitles you just as a human being. And that's where, to my mind, my faith I've been talking about does line up very squarely with our legal system, because that's the premise of our system of individual rights, of the Constitution, of the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. We treat people as individuals entitled to dignity and respect, no matter who they are or what they've done.
turn our attention specifically for a few minutes to Mr. Jones.
Okay.
Students have all read your essay. They know the basics of that story. And one of the things, of course, that comes out of that story is a concern that you were too close to him. I'd really like to ask the question in two ways. One is, do you think you were, personally? And more generally, is there risk of someone getting too close to a client, a lawyer getting too close and stepping out of the bounds of the lawyer's role?
Let me deal with that second question first.
Okay.
Because the simple answer to that one is yes, there is a danger of that. It can happen, and it does happen. I think all helping professionals understand that. If you're going to do a good job as a professional on behalf of a client or a patient, you need to draw upon your expertise and your skill and your judgment, and that necessarily requires some detachment from the person that you're helping. At the same time, if you're really going to help somebody, you have to understand them, you have to have empathy for them. And those seem to be contradictory, and to some extent they are, and the trick really is to balance those, to really care about somebody, to have empathy, to try to understand who they are and want to serve their interests, and at the same time be able to step back from that person. They can't help themselves. You have professional expertise and skills to bring to bear on it that necessarily requires you to keep some distance. So it is entirely possible, I think, to go too far either way. I think saying I'm just going to use my skill and I don't have to give a damn about who these people are. I don't think you're serving your clients well there, but it's certainly true that you can go too far the other direction and lose your objectivity, detachment, and so the client doesn't get what the client deserves from you, which is your professional judgment and skill. Now,
Wait a minute, I'm going to interrupt you because I promised a member of the class that I would ask you this question, and this is where it comes up, and I'm going to ask it in exactly the way it came up yesterday. Is it possible for a lawyer to care too much about the client and care so much that their professionalism is compromised?
Yes, I think it is. And the danger is, it's really twofold. One is that you will lose the kind of detachment and objectivity that we've spent, already much of the first semester of law school teaching people how to analyze and argue both sides of a case, and it's not so much a matter of how you feel about it, it's understanding in a much more rational, analytical, objective way how the law and legal arguments work. It's certainly possible to get so close to somebody, to care so much that somehow you're not able to do that. I think that can happen. But it's also possible to care too much, and that your loyalty to your client, your duty to serve your client, is only one of the virtues of professionalism. And if you go all out on that, this may be a silly example, but if you tried to bust your client out of jail because you thought you cared so much about your client, you didn't want them to have to be there, of course that's wrong, that's illegal, and it would be a violation of lawyer professionalism to care so much. But now, I will say that I think for most lawyers, the bigger danger is not caring enough as opposed to caring too much. I've spent a lot of time working in the lawyer disciplinary system and seeing a lot of lawyers that get in trouble, lose their license. And it's not usually because they care too much about their clients. It's much more often that they just neglect their clients altogether and don't care enough about doing what their clients need them to do.
Talk a little bit about Mr. Jones in particular. The fear or the critique that you might get, I'm sure you've heard over the years. You were too close. Talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm maybe I'm not the right person to answer that, because if I was too close, I might not recognize it. I will say that if it were entirely just me involved, I'm not sure I could answer that question. The good news is I had a community of folks around me. I was the lead lawyer on the case, especially for the events that I write about in that essay. But first and foremost, I had my wife every step of the way, and we'd talk about it, and she'd ask me questions about what's going on, and she was aware of, and if she knows me better than anybody does. But I also had other folks, other lawyers and other professionals who were behind the scenes and giving me advice about it, and we were talking it through. the main danger I'd worry about from the client standpoint, from Lewis Jones' standpoint, did I not do the best job I could for him because of the personal relationship we established? And I really don't think that happened. He was executed, so if all you're looking at is wins and losses and successes and failures, you could say, well, I failed. I don't believe that, and I didn't even from the start. I think I did the best we could do under the circumstances, and the result was the result. It was hard to take. It's still hard to take, but you know I don't judge it based on that. Are there things I could have done differently? We could have done differently on his behalf. That's usually going to be the case in almost any representation. It's complex. There are a lot of decisions that are made. But looking back, I don't see any great failure. Oh, if we'd only done this or that, it would have come out differently. So I don't see that the representation of my client was compromised by the personal relationship. In fact, I think it was enhanced. Not so much that it made a difference in how I represented him in terms of what was filed in court or argued in the White House or that sort of thing, but I think I understood him pretty well, and I think I was able to make sometimes better arguments on his behalf precisely because I got to know him pretty well. I think it might have helped the representation. You know, another aspect of that question, though, is did I get so close that it damaged me somehow?
Well, I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, and I know I'm not the best one to answer that. I don't think so. I think I make reference at the end of that essay that there's a danger either way, and if you try to keep your distance emotionally too much, that takes a lot of emotional energy and effort, and that can be damaging as well. It was hard when we lost that case, but I've lost other cases, and I've even had another client executed, somebody I wasn't nearly as close to, and that was difficult as well. I don't think it damaged me in the long run, so that I can't function anymore. There are lots of things in life that lead to loss and lead to hurt, and part of what you learn the older you get is you work your way through them. You got not so much by yourself, but with folks that you care about and care about you, and you work your way through it and you go forward. Trying to keep your distance so that you don't care at all to begin with takes a different toll that I think in the long run often is worse. So I've thought a lot about it, obviously, but I think I don't regret getting to know Lou Jones the way I did. And the other thing is, I really did enjoy his company, as I say in the essay, and it's hard for a lot of people to believe somebody could do something as horrible as what he did, and it was. I regret to some extent that in what the students have read, I didn't really go into what he did that put him on death row. I'm writing about that in a lot more detail now, and he committed a really brutal, horrible crime, and his victim. It's difficult even now to think back about what he did and the impact on her and on her family. But even knowing that about, and something that he never denied, he acknowledged it himself. He had deep remorse about it. Even with all of that, he was really a pleasure to talk to and get to know. He was an interesting guy, had a fascinating background, great conversationalist, and so just on that kind of level, I enjoyed his company. Some people might really think that's odd, but he was unusual among capital defendants, and I've known a fair number of folks who were under a death sentence. He was unusual in that he was more intelligent, he was more articulate, but he's not that unusual in that almost anybody is pretty interesting if you really get to know them and if you're open to them, and that's part of the empathy I'm talking about. And I think that's part of the joy in lawyering. You get to know your clients in a way that even most other professionals don't, if you really spend a lot of time with a client, which is necessary. And in that case, I really found him a pretty interesting guy.
You know, one of the other things that comes up whenever we talk about walking through the valley is this. You know, we talk a lot in this course about the role of the lawyer and the virtues you need to be a good lawyer and a professional lawyer, but none of us are just lawyers. I mean, we also have other roles in life that we fulfill, and you know, you're a husband and you're a father, and you know, everybody in here has other roles that they're trying to balance and fulfill at the same time that they contemplate being lawyers. One critique of what happened in Walking Through the Valley is the involvement of your family. That Daisy and Will were both there, and I think that some people look at that and think that that wasn't a good decision. Can you talk a little bit about that, and more generally about balancing these roles as lawyer and in other aspects of your life?
Sure, and that's something that I think everybody ought to be thinking about even now, and that's not a foreign question even to first-year law students at this point. I don't have to tell anybody in this room how all-consuming the law can be, even at the outset. But when clients are depending upon you, in a case like the Jones case, or in almost anything you do as a lawyer, the demands of your professional life can be pretty overwhelming. And yet, at the same time, I'm saying before, you got to be authentic to who you are, and even more important than being a lawyer to me is being a husband and being a father.
And grandfather now.
That's exactly right. That may be the most important of all at the moment, as of November. The truth is, people talk about balance as if, you have to, yes, devote a certain part of your life to one aspect of your life and then a certain percentage of your life to other parts. But the truth is, I'm a husband and a father 24/7. But it's also true if you're a professional 24/7. So it's not so much a matter of segmenting it out, it's a matter of figuring out how to make it balance. I'm not the best one to answer that question. Daisy and I actually got married 2 weeks before we started law school 37 years ago, and we went through law school together. We've worked professionally for most of our careers under the same roof at the same place. We tend to take our work home with us more than a lot of folks and talk about it on other occasions. So that's just the way our life has been. And our kids sort of grew up in law school, and I used to teach trial practice with my daughter up there on the bench next to me because she liked to come in and look at trials. I don't recommend that necessarily. I'm just speaking personally from my own experience. We talked about autonomy before, though. The great thing about the jobs that Daisy and I both have had is I was able to go, I coached my son's Little League baseball team, and I was my daughter's Suzuki violin coach. I don't know anything about violin, but you have to be there to do it. And so I went to all of the practices. Flexibility, autonomy in your work life, and of course professors have a lot of that, but lawyers can have that much more than a lot of other lines of work. The ability to be flexible and to be there at the important moments as opposed to only setting aside a couple of hours in the evening, I think is important. So I think it's possible to balance, but it's one of the most difficult things, and it's not something you should ever take for granted. Now, in this case, this is an extreme example, obviously. When you get down to the last couple of months before an execution, it was all-consuming. I think my classroom teaching suffered, and I wasn't able to do a lot of other things I normally do because it just was taking all of my time working on the case. But because we're so close as a family, Daisy was right there every step of the way. She wasn't working on the case, but she was aware of what I was doing. I would talk to her about things. And our kids were involved in it. Our daughter was at college. Our son was in high school. He was 17 at the events I'm talking about. And they were well aware of what was going on. Our son Will actually talked to Lou Jones on the telephone a couple of times. He would call, and I would talk to him at home. And the way it is in prison, you have to call, collect. And if my son knew if I was there and he called, he would take it. But he would usually chat with him a little bit. So he actually felt like he knew him a little bit. Master Sergeant Jones would usually give my son orders and say, now I want you to write this down, tell your father this or that. So, but they knew each other even in that sense. So when it came down then to that final week, my first thought was, no reason for them to be there. Daisy couldn't go into the prison anyway. Why would you go to Indiana there? So I said, no, I'll just go. But she's the one who insisted that she go along. And she was right. She knew me better than I knew myself, that she needed to be there for my sake, and she was support to me through all of it. And so that made a big difference. As far as our son being present, that was his call to make, and in fact, he's the one who asked us. The plan was he was going to go, it was his spring break, he was going to go visit his sister in college where she was in Houston, and he'd be all right that way. And he said, no, I really want to be there. He had followed it. He was interested in the issues involved. And I'll never know if it was the right call to make, but we said, all right then. And so he went along, and he was present in the hotel room and otherwise for many of the events. He says, still to this day, he's now 28 years old, that he doesn't regret it all. He's glad we let him go. There may be all kinds of deep psychological traumas involved with him that will get uncovered at some point. But at least so far, so good. So I don't regret that. That's an extreme example, of course. And I am entirely sympathetic to the point that you got to get some separation. You got to leave your work behind, and you got to enjoy life without being stressed about work. And I think I'm pretty good at that much of the time. But when your client's about to be executed and you think, if I could do this or that, sometimes everything else has to take a back seat. But after that, we took some time off, and we enjoyed ourselves without thinking about any of that.
Well, day to day, to some extent, that ability to switch gears or turn it off is a survival skill.
Oh, right.
To be in it over the long haul, you can't be burning your afterburners.
Oh, it isn't. Burnout is an issue among our profession, and if you can't scale it back, you can. Although, speaking of that, I think it's a lack of passion about what you're doing that leads to that problem more than caring too much. At least in my experience, if you really get a lot of fulfillment and meaning and even joy out of your work, you tend not to burn out on it. But the only way you can have that is if you do know how to back off from it and strike that balance that's appropriate for you.
I'm going to turn this over to the students in just a few minutes and see what they want to ask you. But as you know, and as they will begin to learn, when I get to this stage with all of our visitors, I have the same question that I ask you, and that is, you have a captive audience, right? I can require them to be here, and almost all first-year law students. We have a few transfers, but I want to open it to you to say to them anything you think they should hear. Anything, maybe something that you wish you had heard when you were at their stage. Any words of wisdom or advice that you have for them generally about anything.
Well, sure. Let me say one quick thing about the Jones case, and then I do want to take advantage of that opportunity. Over the years, as I've talked about this case and students have written, a lot of people think it's inappropriate to inject religion into the lawyer-client relationship, and I agree with them. It would be highly inappropriate for me to start proselytizing to my client or praying with my client. The reason Lou Jones and I ended up talking about religion so much was it was so clearly a part of his life, and he wanted to talk about it. And the first few times I met with him and corresponded with him, I didn't respond in kind. But at some point I thought that's something that's important to him. He doesn't have that many outlets, and he wanted to talk about parts of Scripture, and that's interesting to me, and so I responded. But the point there is, lawyers are in a power relationship with their client. It is entirely inappropriate for a lawyer to start to try to use the lawyer's religious faith to manipulate the client, or to, even with all good intentions, try to convert the client, something like that. That's not part of a lawyer's role, and that would be wrong. But if you're going to be empathetic to your client, really understand your client, meeting your client where they are, and it was something that I shared with him in a lot of ways, and I don't regret that at all. But I don't want to lose the opportunity to answer that question you just asked. Looking back at law school, and I think about my career since, I could not have imagined all the twists and turns it would have taken. So I guess if I were going to give advice, it would primarily be open to whatever may come along. You can't know at this point, and if you think you know and think you got it all mapped out, you're wrong. That's good news, because you don't need to know at this point. You don't need to have it all worked out. Figure out what you really care about. Figure out what really turns you on and moves you. And if there's nothing in the law you can find, then maybe you ought to go in a different direction from the law. But at this point, you don't have any idea of what there is in the law that may excite you. You may have liked a professor or a course along the way, but that doesn't tell you whether practicing law in that area is something you'll like. So be open, but also be patient. It's going to take a while to figure out what moves you, what you care about. But I am saying that it's really important to find work that means something to you. As we were saying before, practicing law takes a lot of your time and your emotional energy, and if you're doing something that you just really don't like or don't care about, it will take a toll on you. So you might not find your passion right off the bat. Be open to different possibilities as they come along. I mean, I never thought I'd spend 15 years of my life in Lubbock, Texas, but it was a great experience. Raised my kids out there. Glad to be home in Georgia at this stage of my life, but you have to be open to a lot of different things. Having said that, it's true that sometimes it's not for everybody. And if you get involved in different kinds of law work or practice and none of it appeals to you, do something else with your life. Life's too short to do something that makes you miserable, that doesn't even really bring you fulfillment. But it may take a while to figure that out, and that's okay. I would not be where I am if I had said, this is what I'm going to do, I'm just going to follow that path no matter what. You have to be open, and you have to have relationships with other people that matter in your life, that you respond to that. Daisy followed me to Texas. I had a job and she didn't, but then she got a job in Georgia, so I left what I had to come here. You have to be flexible in that sense. It's great to have a community of folks that you can talk to. If you have friends who are not in law school, that are still your friends even now after you've spent this time in law school, hang on to that. Try to get to know folks outside your work so that you can enrich your life, not just with people that go through the same thing you do. So be open, but be patient, and I would hang on to relationships. That's still more important than any of the rest of this. The people that are closest to you and others, don't lose that. And I say that specifically because it's a danger. I don't need to tell you that. You're probably already aware of how you can get sucked into this law school environment and lose a lot of what's important to you otherwise. And what I'm here to tell you is it's entirely possible to really get into the law, to get into the practice of law and get a lot out of it and get a lot of fulfillment, and keep a lot of the other important things in your life. You have to be conscious of it and keep working at it.
We turn this over to the students. You have a question? Yes, ma'am. And for the purpose of the recording, I'm going to repeat your question. So,
okay. Professor Bowman, you mentioned that on our blogs, many of the students brought up the issues of their faith, and obviously this is a very important issue for Professor Floyd as well. He made several statements about the importance of his faith, about God being a central component of Christianity, Judaism, and the Islamic faith. But I'm wondering if we're in a very insulated academic environment here. Many of the students here have not been out in the real world for many, many years. Could you speak to what the situation is likely going to be when we do get out into the real world and into the professional world? Because I think that having a faith-based professional ethos is admirable and very important, but I don't think it's what your average lawyer will encounter on a daily basis.
So if I can just rephrase the question for Professor Floyd, that if you're in law school with a firm ethos based upon a religious faith, and you're safely within the bounds of the building, what happens when you leave the building and you go out into practice where not everybody certainly is going to share that faith? How do you deal with that as a lawyer rather than a law student? Is that fair?
I actually do have a book that I'm an editor of. It's called Can a Good Christian Be a Good Lawyer? And if you want to know the answer to that question, well, I can't answer it. It's a collect. I love the book, and I can say that in all due modesty because I didn't write the book. I just helped put it together. It's a collection of essays by 20-something authors, all of whom are practicing lawyers, all of whom are professing Christians who write about how they have dealt with the question you ask. And there's no one right answer. And it's something you got to answer for yourself. It's not easy. I would say it's certainly possible. If it weren't, I couldn't do what I do. So that book is something I'd rather than answer it myself, I recommend what those folks did. But even better than the book is what originally, where the book came from originally, and that is there was a symposium issue of the Texas Tech Law Review that I helped put together in 1997, and there are actually 45 authors, and it's a much wider range. So the publisher wanted to do a book about Christianity, which was fine, but actually I think much more interesting is the Faith in the Law Symposium issue of Texas Tech Law Review. It's not hard to find. There are 45 essays. They're not law review articles. They're personal essays from people about how they have reconciled the religious faith with their work as lawyers. And it's a wide range of people, including Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, and so it's about religious faith much more broadly defined, and it's a wide range of practice experience among those folks, people that do a lot of different kinds of work. So rather than me answer the question, I would refer you to the multiple answers from a lot of different people. I will say that pretty much everybody said from their own personal perspective, their own religious background, they were able to reconcile their religious faith or beliefs with their work as a lawyer, but many of them recount struggles and how you have to work through that.
Okay. Other questions for Professor Floyd? Surely you have some. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Professor Floyd. When we read your article about Lou Jones, you talked at the very end how the whole experience really underscored your opposition to capital punishment. I know you could probably teach a semester or much more than that on your views on capital punishment. Just in a short answer, what are the main tenets or reasons for that viewpoint?
Well, I have taught, and I will teach before y'all graduate, I'm sure. We have a course on capital punishment law that I teach, and it is a semester-long course. It is not a semester-long course on my views on the death penalty, though. In fact, it's a course on law, and it's a complicated, arcane area of the law. And I'm actually kind of proud when I teach that course. I have many students who are very much in favor of the death penalty, want to prosecute death penalty cases, and they always appreciate the class and they learn a lot from it. And that's my goal as a teacher. My goal is not to indoctrinate or convince anybody to share my views. But you asked for my views, and I think it's only fair to share them. I have been opposed to capital punishment as far back as I can remember, and I got to say it does stem from my religious faith. And as I alluded to that earlier, that I fundamentally don't believe that human beings ought to make that ultimate judgment about who deserves to live and who doesn't. Certain people deserve to be punished severely, and we as society need to be protected at all costs from the danger posed by certain people. But I think it's possible to do that without ending the life. But the main reason that I think capital punishment is so problematic in our society, and I think the reason that capital punishment is slowly disappearing. You may not be aware of it, but we sentence far fewer people to death right now than we did 20 years ago in this country, and far fewer people being executed. And it's partly because, and many more states are deciding they don't want to have it, and it's not based on what I was saying about my religious belief and the worth and dignity or sacredness of human life. It's that the whole system is just a mess. It's absolutely broken. We are not capable, I think, in our criminal justice system of figuring out which of the really bad murderers are the very worst that deserve the ultimate punishment, and doing that fairly and reliably. We can't even get it right far too often as far as even having the right murderer. As you may be aware, there are nearly 150 people now that have been sentenced to death, were on death row, and then later found out through DNA evidence or other conclusive evidence that they had the wrong person. I think that alone is enough of a reason to really give you pause about whether we ought to be doing that, executing people, because once somebody's been executed, it's too late to exonerate them, at least to do them any good, right? But apart from that, our death penalty system, we don't have a national death penalty, we have the pockets of it. There are certain parts of the country where there are a fair number of people sentenced to death. People that commit the same crime, just as bad as people, don't get sentenced to death in different regions. That's true even within states. And then apart from that, the defendants who have good lawyers don't get executed. I can state that with almost 99% certainty. If somebody has an excellent lawyer with good resources, they're not going to be executed. If, on the other hand, they're Buck Fugate and they have a lawyer that makes no objections, withdraws all the motions, and really doesn't do anything, of course he was executed. Now, Buck Fugate might very well have intentionally waited around and killed his wife on purpose. We don't know from reading the account that y'all read in Spectator Sport. But what I do know is that he did not have a lawyer that did what lawyers need to do, and that is contest the case. It was an arguable case, and even if he was guilty, you got to give a jury some reason not to sentence somebody to death if you're defending them, and his lawyers didn't. So that's just a great example, I think, of one of the real flaws in our system. Most people who get executed not because they were the worst people who committed the worst crime, it's because they're poor and they had poor lawyers. And that's just not a fair system either. But I'll get off my soapbox now.
Thank you. That's why you're here. Other questions from students? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any advice for us as we go into the period where we're starting to look for and apply for summer internships?
Right here, the question is, do you have advice about summer internships and that whole process?
The main advice I'd give you is now is the time to be trying to line up something for the summer. There are not paid jobs in law firms very much anymore for people that it's been a long time since there were. Government and nonprofit employers love to have students in the summer, but they don't have money in their budgets to pay them. But there is plenty of demand for those positions, including from students from other law schools. So just directly contacting the district attorney's office in the county where you're from, if that's what you're interested in, or the judges' chambers. They like to have help in the summer. They like to have students. But the burden is really on you to go out and make the contacts and find them. Through our program here at the law school, we have lots of contacts, and I'm always glad to help people. But depending on where you want to go or the kind of work you're involved in, we can try to help match you up. If you are interested in getting academic credit for a placement in the summer, as long as it's with a government or a nonprofit organization, not with a private law firm, we can generally approve placements for summer externship credit. And so and we're glad to do that, and that can be a good learning experience. But even if you just wanted to volunteer somewhere, you don't want to worry about credit in the summer, I would still urge you to try to get some experience related to the law in the summer. Law school can be frustrating. I don't need to tell you all that. And it can be discouraging. And every summer, every fall, I have returning second-year students say, man, I wasn't sure the law was for me after the first year, but being involved in a real law office or at the courthouse or getting to know judges, thought, I think I might like this. I want to pursue that. And so the main reason is just to help you think about what you want to do going forward. I would urge you, even if it's just for a few weeks, even if it's part-time and strictly volunteer, try to be around lawyers and judges this summer, if at all possible. But we can work on getting you credit for it too. And we even, as I told folks who were at the meeting last week, we have a limited stipend program, and you're eligible to apply to get. We'll help you with living expenses. I have no idea how much is in the budget for that at this point, or how many stipends there will be, but that is a possibility.
What else? Yes, sir.
Do you have any stories from when you were starting off, maybe as a law clerk, where you had made a mistake and then you had to learn pretty quick?
Yeah, as a law clerk, the good news about that is I wasn't in charge of anything. I was working on behalf of the judge, and she was very sharp, and she cared a lot about things, so that I didn't draft a judicial opinion that she just sort of glanced over and submitted. She was a great editor. And so I learned a lot about writing from her because she would go over every draft. She would let us draft opinions, but the final product wasn't very much like what I wrote in the first place. So I learned from that. But I tell you, learning from mistakes was when I went to the legal aid clinic at the University of Georgia, and I was really just a frontline public defender. The first case I ever tried was a felony case. I was defending a guy in a felony. It was also the first jury trial I'd ever been seen before. I'd gotten through law school without ever going to the courthouse and watching a trial in person. And so I actually was the lead counsel for the defendant. And I did not do a very good job in that case. I did not understand evidence. I'd taken evidence. I even made a pretty good grade. And it was lost on me. I was a lousy cross-examiner. I did my closing argument by pacing constantly in front of the jury and waving my hands around. The judge was nice enough to call me in afterwards and suggest some things I should do differently the next time. That's one thing you'll find is most lawyers and judges care about people coming along behind them. That's one of the virtues of professionalism, is being committed to the furtherance of the profession and individuals in it. And they'll help you out as long as you're humble enough about it to ask for help and recognize that you're not going to do it right early on. My client was guilty, and the jury found him guilty. And I had worked hard on it, but I was not very effective as a trial lawyer. I wasn't very effective the next 2 or 3 trials. By the time I'd done it a few times and had tried to reflect on it and get advice from other people, I got much better at it. And I decided trials really are pretty fun. I do like doing it. But it takes a lot of work and takes practice to get there, like most things in life.
Tim, I'd love to continue this, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So join me in thanking Professor Floyd.